Imagine sitting on your couch, right? Your heart is just pounding against your ribs. Your palms are literally sweating as you watch this brutal, high-stakes crime unfold right in front of you.
Yeah, which is just a normal Tuesday night now.
Exactly. But, I mean, 50 years ago, deliberately seeking out that kind of intense um, physiological stress, that was considered a psychological anomaly
Oh, absolutely.
because we had traditional broadcasting back then. And with that came these incredibly strict, literal rule books dictating what could and could not go on the air.
Uh-huh.
Like a married couple sharing a bed used to be considered scandalous.
Right, the separate twin beds era.
Yeah. But today, that heart-pounding, sweat-inducing exposure to, high-definition trauma, explicit violence, heavy substance abuse, it's just standard. So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're taking a hard look at the sources you shared with us, which analyze this whole normalization of violence and addiction in modern digital media.
And it really is a profound cultural and honestly biological shift. The sources we're looking at today make a very compelling and somewhat unsettling argument about what researchers are now calling the era of digital desensitization.
Digital desensitization, which is a heavy term.
It is.
Yeah.
Because the core premise here is that the incredibly dark, blood-soaked, and, well, substance-heavy shows dominating our screens, they aren't just a reflection of some edgy modern artistic movement.
Right, because our mission today is to figure out the why and the how behind this shift. The analysis argues that what we are experiencing is basically a calculated biological strike on the human brain.
Completely calculated.
Because the old ethical boundaries of network television haven't just vanished, right? They've been entirely replaced by something much more ruthless, which is the attention economy.
Yeah, and that phrase, the attention economy, is really the absolute foundation of this entire phenomenon. When you scroll through a streaming platform and you look at the sheer volume of, like, drug use and the wildly spiking levels of violence in almost every scene of a modern hit, you have to look at it through the lens of a fierce, multi-billion-dollar competition.
It's all about keeping eyes on the screen.
Exactly. These are highly strategic moves. They are specifically designed to target and manipulate the viewer's dopamine system, simply because that is the most efficient way to prevent you from clicking away.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because we've established the landscape, right? We've moved from a sanitized broadcast world to this Wild West where your attention is the ultimate currency. But how exactly are these platforms biologically manipulating the viewer? Let's get into the actual neuroscience of this dopamine loop the sources talk about.
So, to understand the mechanism, you first have to look at the environment. It is a sea of massive, relentless content. Thousands of shows are dropping constantly.
It's overwhelming.
It is. So to simply be noticeable in that environment, creators have to rely on extreme shock value. But shock value isn't just a narrative tool anymore. It's a biological hack.
Got biological hack.
Yeah. When you are suddenly confronted with graphic violence or highly taboo, edgy themes on a high-definition screen, it triggers a rapid biological arousal.
You're talking about a literal fight or flight response, right? Even though we are sitting safely in our living rooms in sweatpants.
Exactly that. On a primal evolutionary level, your brain's amygdala, which is the threat detection center, it struggles to differentiate between the high-definition pixels showing a murder and a literal physical threat in your immediate environment.
Wow.
It perceives danger. So it dumps cortisol and adrenaline into your system. What's fascinating here is that your ancient survival instincts kick in and your brain essentially screams, there's a threat here, I must focus entirely on this to survive. It forces absolute, unwavering focus.
That is wild to think about. Your brain is going into a primal survival mode, but the streaming platform just registers that biological panic as, viewer retention.
Yeah, it's just a metric to them.
But here's where I get stuck. You can't just keep hitting that same alarm bell forever, can you? I mean, eventually the brain figures out it's not in actual danger. The sources mention this concept called threshold elevation.
It's a crucial concept. The human brain is incredibly adaptive. It builds an immunity to constant stimuli very quickly to protect itself from sensory overload.
Because otherwise we'd just be exhausted all the time.
Exactly. If your brain stayed in a state of maximum panic every time you watched a thriller, you wouldn't be able to function. So the brain's receptors literally downregulate. They require a stronger stimulus to produce the same chemical response.
I always think of this mechanism like eating spicy food.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Right. When you first start, a mild jalapeno pepper might make your eyes water and your nose run. You get this huge rush of endorphins from it. But if you eat that mild pepper every single day with your dinner, eventually your receptors adjust.
You don't feel anything.
You don't feel a thing. To get that same rush, that same physical burn, you constantly have to upgrade to a hotter and hotter hot sauce.
That is the perfect way to visualize it.
Mm.
And that dynamic is exactly what is driving the decisions in writers' rooms and production studios right now.
The hot sauce arms race.
Literally. A violent scene that was deeply shocking and highly effective at grabbing your attention in season 1, well, it will feel completely ordinary, almost boring by season 3, because your biological threshold is elevated.
So they have to push the envelope.
Right. This adaptation forces creators into an escalating arms race. To get the exact same baseline level of dopamine release and viewer engagement they had a year ago, they had to continually make scenes bloodier, more explicit, and push further into taboo territory.
Okay, so if the brain builds an immunity to raw shock, creators inevitably hit a wall. They can't just show more blood forever without it turning into a ridiculous cartoon. So according to the analysis, how do they keep us hooked when the pure shock wears off?
They changed tactics.
Right, and this brings us to something the sources call the aestheticizing of the abyss. They start dressing up the darkness.
Yes. We transition from the raw shock of violence to the highly curated style of self-destruction.
Yeah.
This is incredibly prevalent in global hit shows right now, particularly in how they portray substance abuse.
Like making it look cool.
Exactly. When you look at how drug and alcohol addiction are depicted on screen today, they are very rarely presented as the devastating, ugly, isolating tragedies they are in real life.
Right, it's never the gritty reality.
No. Instead, addiction is frequently presented as a shorthand for character depth. It's framed as this profound, almost glamorous, existential angst.
The tortured, misunderstood genius trope. But how are they actually pulling that off psychologically? Because we all logically know addiction is destructive, right?
They pull it off through what researchers call visual romanticism, and it relies heavily on creating cognitive dissonance. Think about a typical scene showing heavy substance abuse in a modern prestige drama.
Okay, picturing it.
The directors don't light it harshly. They use impressive, moody color palettes, maybe a warm golden hour glow or cool neon-soaked shadows. They layer in a melancholic, perfectly curated indie soundtrack.
Always the indie soundtrack.
Always. And they dress the characters in incredibly cool, aspirational wardrobes.
So our eyes and ears are basically telling our brain, this is beautiful, this is safe, this is a vibe, and that's overriding the logical part of our brain that knows the character is actively destroying their life.
That's the mechanism. It works entirely on a subconscious level. It reframes the very real horrors of addiction into a highly curated lifestyle element. It makes the abyss look inviting.
Now, I want to push back on this premise just a little bit.
Sure.
Because hasn't art always explored the dark side of humanity? I mean, you look at Shakespeare, it's full of murder, tragedy, and completely flawed, self-destructive characters. Hamlet was a psychological mess. Macbeth was a ruthless killer. We've always had this darkness in our stories. Why is a modern streaming show fundamentally any different or more dangerous than a classic tragedy?
This raises an important question, and it's a very common, very understandable defense of modern media. But the difference, the crucial psychological difference that the sources highlight lies in the frequency, the formatting, and the sheer volume of exposure.
A dosage basis.
Exactly, the dosage. Shakespeare might have given us the tragedy of the Macbeth, but you didn't watch Macbeth for 6 hours a day, every single day, in hyper-realistic 4K resolution right in your living room.
Yep.
The danger identified here is the constant glamorous repetition.
It's the normalization through sheer saturation.
Yes. And to understand why that saturation matters, the sources bring in Albert Bandura's social learning theory. Bandura is famous for the Bodo doll experiment in the 1960s.
Right, where they showed kids a video of an adult beating up an inflatable clown doll and then put the kids in a room with the same doll.
Exactly. And what Bandura found wasn't just that the kids copied the adult, it was that the kids found new, innovative ways to attack the doll.
Oh, wow. They got creative with it.
They did.
Yeah.
Because they learned that the behavior itself, the aggression, was socially acceptable because it was modeled for them. People, and youth in particular, have a very strong innate tendency to mimic the behaviors of characters they find appealing or aspirational.
That makes total sense.
So when you shove beautifully lit, stylized addiction into every single episode of a show you binge watch, You are slowly destroying the societal perception that this behavior is abnormal.
You're wearing down the stigma, but not in a healthy, empathetic way. You're normalizing the actual self-destruction.
Precisely.
It shifts the depiction from being a cautionary tale, which is what classic tragedies usually were, to an aesthetic mood board. It tells the subconscious, this isn't a disease, this is just how interesting, complex people cope with a difficult world.
It renders the abnormal completely ordinary. And that is a very difficult cognitive loop to break out of once it's established.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because this romanticization of the self-destructive addict, it naturally evolves into the romanticization of how these characters treat other people.
Right, the outward harm.
Yeah, we shift from self-harm and the addiction and the angst to outwardly directed harm, which is the violence. And this is all filtered through our cultural obsession with the antihero.
The rise of the antihero is a central piece of this tussle. Across both local and foreign shows, we are seeing a massive sustained increase in protagonists who operate outside the law. They use extreme, brutal violence, but it's always for supposedly justified reasons.
Like they're protecting their family or they are taking down a worse villain.
Exactly. And the analysis argues that this specific framing paves the way for profound moral erosion.
Because of something called the catharsis illusion. Like, think about your own binge-watching habits for a second. You've had a terrible day, your boss was unreasonable, the world feels incredibly unfair and frustrating.
We've all been there.
Right. So you sit down and watch a vigilante character brutally take down the bad guys. It feels good. It feels like you're releasing steam from a pressure valve. But the source material is essentially saying, we think watching these dark antiheroes is like releasing steam, but in reality, the constant exposure is actually breaking the pressure valve entirely.
It's making us completely numb to the heat.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, your analogy of the broken valve is physiologically accurate. The clinical term for this process is desensitization.
Let's get into the biology of that.
Let's look at what is physically happening in your body. Normally, if you see someone in pain, your sympathetic nervous system fires up. Your sweat glands activate, your heart rate increases, your breathing gets shallow. You feel a physiological echo of their distress.
Which is basically empathy, right?
Yes, that physical reaction is the biological basis of human empathy.
It's your body saying, this is wrong, someone is hurt.
Right. But as you sit there, week after week, watching constant graphic violence, even if it's narratively justified by an anti-hero, your brain learns that this stimulus doesn't require a physical response.
Because you're just on the couch.
Exactly. So it literally downregulates the sympathetic nervous system. You stop sweating, your heart stays at a resting 60 beats per minute while you watch a massacre on screen. Constant exposure to simulated violence physically dulls your biological empathy.
Wait, hold on a second. Hasn't this whole watching violence makes you violent argument been heavily debunked?
Oh, completely.
Because I remember the massive panic over video games in the 90s, and years of studies eventually show that playing violent games doesn't actually turn kids into violent criminals. So how is this analysis claiming something different?
That's a brilliant distinction to make, and it's where a lot of people misunderstand the research. The sources aren't arguing the old 90s panic that you will watch a violent show and instantly become a violent criminal. They aren't saying it causes aggression.
Okay, so what is it causing?
They are saying it causes apathy. The far more insidious danger of a dulled sympathetic nervous system is that you become indifferent. This leads to a mass-scale bystander effect.
Ah, I see. So it's not that I'm going to go out and start fights. It's that if I see a fight happen in real life, my body doesn't register the panic or the need to intervene.
You've been trained, biologically and psychologically, to sit back and watch. You become perfectly content to just be a viewer when real people suffer in front of you because your brain has categorized witnessing trauma as a passive consumer activity.
Okay, that is deeply chilling because right now we are currently experiencing this training through flat 2D screens. But the analysis scales this problem up in a way that feels very sci-fi, but is actually right around the corner.
Yes, the technological leap.
If these flat screens are already dulling our sympathetic nervous systems and eroding our empathy, what happens when we step inside the screen? The sources take all of this, the attention economy, the dopamine loops, the desensitization, and apply it to the immersive digital future. We are talking about the metaverse and virtual reality.
This is where the long-term consequences of everything we've discussed truly crystallize. The research suggests that this constant, daily content bombardment isn't just a byproduct of modern entertainment. It is actively, day by day, preparing humanity for a state of digital numbness.
Digital numbness.
We are experiencing a gradual loss of reality.
Think about the VR headset that might be sitting in your closet right now. You put that on, and the line between the physical world and digital fiction doesn't just blur, it basically disappears.
Right now with streaming, there is still a slight psychological barrier, which is the physical screen itself. It's a frame. You are fundamentally a passive consumer.
Right, you're outside of it.
But when people transition into purely fictional, fully immersive 3D universes where they're actively manipulating an avatar, those psychological boundaries are practically non-existent. It's like spending years training in a flight simulator where the gravity has been turned off.
I love that analogy. It's perfect.
When you finally step into the real cockpit, or in this case, when you step into a fully immersive 3D digital world, you've already unlearned the fundamental laws of physics. Or, to apply it to our topic, you've unlearned the fundamental laws of human empathy and ethics.
Because you've spent the last decade watching highly stylized addiction and consequence-free violence on your couch.
Exactly.
So when you step into the metaverse, you are already primed to accept highly unethical, destructive behaviors as perfectly normal. You just justify it by saying, well, I've seen this 1,000 times on my TV. What's the difference if I'm doing it virtually?
The vanishing lines between passive consumption and active virtual participation mean that the ethical decay we are casually watching today becomes the behavioral baseline for the immersive worlds of tomorrow. We are drastically lowering the ethical floor of humanity before we even step foot into the virtual room.
So we've gone from the writer's room hacking our dopamine with shock value just to keep us from changing the app, to the visual styling of addiction making self-destruction look like an aspirational mood board.
Yeah, quite the journey.
We've talked about how our physical empathy is being systematically dulled by the anti-hero catharsis illusion, and how all of this is essentially psychological training, preparing us to be numb, apathetic actors in a virtual universe. The sources really bring this massive journey together by pointing out that this media transformation has fundamentally turned us into emotional consumers.
We are consuming high arousal emotions the exact same way we consume fast food. It's cheap, it's engineered to be addictive, and it's ultimately terrible for our systems.
So true.
And in a culture where extreme behavior, graphic violence, and addiction are presented as the absolute norm, protecting your own cognitive boundaries becomes an incredibly difficult daily task. It requires active effort.
But there's a takeaway here that isn't just doom and gloom.
Right. There is hope.
The source material emphasizes a very specific and I think deeply empowering concluding thought. It argues that as we move into this hyper-connected, immersive future, the greatest, most vital skill you can cultivate isn't going to be coding.
No,
It's not going to be technological literacy or understanding the blockchain. The ultimate future skill is going to be something called cognitive defense.
Cognitive defense is the conscious learned ability to recognize when your biology is being manipulated by a screen. It is recognizing that spike in your heart rate or that feeling of numbness and understanding the mechanism behind it.
Seeing the matrix, basically.
Exactly. It is the ability to escape this media-provided high arousal state, to intentionally step away from the dopamine loop of shock and style, and actively choose to cling to the calm, ethical fabric of reality.
So what does this all mean? Well, knowing how the magic trick works ruins the illusion. And knowing how these platforms hack your ancient survival instincts just to boost their quarterly engagement metrics gives you the power to actually choose what you let into your brain. You can rebuild the pressure valve.
You really can.
But as we wrap up this deep dive, it leaves me thinking about that calm, ethical fabric of reality the sources urge us to cling to. Because if our brains become so completely, thoroughly adapted to the hyperarousal, the moody aesthetics, and the endless escalating shock value of the digital world, will that calm, ethical reality eventually start to feel to us like the simulation?
That's a terrifying thought.
Right. If we are so used to the fireworks, might we one day need a radical, deliberate psychological detox just to remember how to experience normal, beautiful human boredom again?